Hi everyone. I'm going to tell you about the making of the real Anthony Fauci documentary movie from my perspective as the writer-director, making the film adaptation of the book by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'll start off telling you briefly about my background. I've been working in film and TV for 16 years. While I was at school, I worked on set for various indie films and applied to several TV networks and boutique production houses in Manhattan, and soon landed a job at BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation in America. I learned the ropes of writing and producing. I worked on original series, comedy shows.
Shamelessly saucy. You and Julia weren't just watching television, were you?
What makes you say that?
Reality shows, documentaries, British films, and the creative services department there was small enough that I was able to learn many areas of post-production, and I just really ate it up. It was really an amazing experience, and I worked with some amazing people. From there I moved to HBO. Documentaries. HBO really encouraged my creativity. So I was producing and editing.
Would you like to hear a story? There's a girl and a dog, and there's a tornado. Well, no.
Welcome to Australia.
The most successful and popular series that I worked on was Game of Thrones. I worked on the first season, the launch of Game of Thrones. And as one of the many producer-editors, I worked on promotional pieces and behind-the-scenes short movies.
I've done feature films. I've not seen anything on this massive scale.
It's pretty intense.
I remember reading that scene in the book and just thinking, well, something's going to come along to save him, because obviously Ned's not going to die, it's Ned. And then it doesn't.
I also worked for Cinemax and Nickelodeon and others. And what was great also was because it's a lot more rigid than filmmaking. So I kind of started off learning the sort of formulas that you needed to abide by, and work at an extremely fast pace with insane deadlines that you just could not miss. It was not an option. It was a really excellent experience. It taught me a lot of discipline in this space. After TV, I wanted to work on more films. I did some research work for Doug Liman's political thriller about the CIA operative Valerie Plame's memoir. That was a movie starring Naomi Watts and Sean Penn, and it was called Fair Game. I also worked as an editor in various genres: psychological thrillers, dramas, documentaries, comedies, a romantic comedy with director Nick Brooks, who's the son of Mel Brooks, who was the executive producer of this cute little film that we did called Sam. I also spent 2 years working on a political documentary about the corporate media called The Brainwashing of My Dad. I worked closely with the director, Jen Sanko. She's an award-winning indie documentary filmmaker who was telling her personal story about her father.
But this isn't a story about just one man. It's the story about a media phenomenon that changed a father and divided a nation.
The movie was produced and narrated by actor Matthew Modine, and the interviews included media experts such as Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, political consultants and commentators like David Brock, Frank Luntz, and many others. I was editing, co-writing, and researching. That's when I learned about the concerted manipulation of mainstream news outlets, particularly that they are owned by just a handful of corporations that have specific political agendas, and which is obviously the opposite of what we want them to have, especially when we're trying to get our unbiased news, local or global or whatever. So fast forward to 2020, and the subject of the media manipulation would come up again, and this time I felt it on a more personal level. What was most interesting and surprising was that during COVID, I noticed that even the independent media outlets that I had begun to trust, they were turning as well. They seemed to be parroting what the corporate media was saying. So things became very obvious to me then, and I assumed it was the same for all of my open-minded, thoughtful, independent thinking fellow New Yorkers who had always been standing up against big corporations. But interestingly, that was just simply not the case. And that started me on a path of researching the truth and coming to know more intimately the people whose voices had been suppressed now for decades. Just kind of looking into whatever the media was telling us, I would then do a little bit of my own background checks. And if there was a study, for example, a medical or scientific study, who was funding that study, who owned it? And a lot of the times it would lead back to those same characters, those same corporations. So during this, I found independent journalists that were providing links to official documents and real studies, just sourcing their work. So every time that they wrote an article or did their independent newscasts, I would be able to see the links to everything that they talked about in the descriptions or, linked into their articles, such as the defender of Children's Health Defense. And at the time, I felt it was so important to save these documents, to download certain documentaries and videos and news sources and things like that. So I started collecting and downloading these things. I didn't know exactly what I would use them for yet. I imagined I would use it through my writing or making movies, but at the time I was just kind of collecting them and storing them in folders. And at that time I was also very isolated in New York City. Everyone who was close to me had taken the shot, and whenever I spoke about my research, I was treated like I was kind of really out there. Then I heard about Bobby's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and I started to read it in November 2021. And it was mind-blowing. I felt like it was like a movie to me already. It was like a real-life mystery thriller. And with all the research that I had been doing over the past year, his research from his book went even deeper, and I just was really excited about it. It was just a wealth of information broken down in a way that I thought would make an amazing documentary. I saw that Children's Health Defense had opened their fellowship program, and the deadline was about a week away. I quickly applied and pitched the idea of doing a documentary film of the Real Anthony Fauci book, among other ideas that I had. And I was accepted to CHD TV. I'm thrilled to connect with the most extraordinary people. I couldn't believe my luck in connecting with such talented, highly skilled, thoughtful individuals from all walks of life, from all over the world, of various professional backgrounds, and we were all supportive and serious about making a difference. Then about 1 month into the fellowship, as fate would have it, I heard from CHD that there was a studio set up to produce the Real Anthony Fauci film for Children's Health Defense, and I was so excited. I asked to be connected. My CV was forwarded to the studio, and right away the studio had me start writing the script in February of 2022. The producer that contracted me to write the movie script told me that he usually uses another director who shoots interviews and just sort of intuitively develops the story afterwards in post. But in order to make a film adaptation of Bobby's book, we would need to have a script. And he said his studio had never worked off of a script before. So he asked me if I could do it in 3 to 4 weeks. And what that entailed was to read the book, break it down into chronological order. Bobby's book is not told chronologically, but I needed to create a concise chronological storyline while obviously staying true and faithful to the book. And then he also asked me to identify all people in the book that needed to be interviewed and write up all of the interview questions. The producer said he doesn't do voiceovers in his shows, and he wanted the interviewees to tell the entire story. Okay, so 3 to 4 weeks. I started February 14th on Valentine's Day and finished on my birthday 1 month later. So for me, once I have the opening in my mind, then I can sort of break down the rest in an outline format. So something I learned from working at the big television networks, there is a sort of formula that is pretty much guaranteed to engage your audience. Basically, the main takeaways that I always think about is that the beginning needs to pull in your audience right at the get-go, has to hook them in. And the ending of the movie, or the ending of the episode, the ending of the show, the ending of whatever it is, the ending needs to be memorable. The ending has to also have an impact. And then, I find that everything in the middle just sort of falls into place. It kind of like you work that intuitively. So when putting together the script, the most kind of important thing that I was thinking of first was the beginning. It was so incredibly important. And then after that, I thought of the end. How am I going to end the whole thing? And then filling in the middle. So that's kind of how I worked. To pull in the audience, I was thinking, what is a common denominator with all people? And the first thing that came to my mind is that Bobby Kennedy, with his personal experience that he explains in the book, and it's very kind of like, it's so authentic, it's so honest, it's even kind of vulnerable. I thought anybody can relate to that, no matter who you are. Everybody has gone through some kind of trial or challenge or shock in their life that has brought them to another level of awareness. Even in the intro of his book, he does talk about why he's putting together this book. And so I really honed in on that. And then I had to think visually, what did I want that to look like? I had written down to the producer and the production manager my thought process on the opening sequence with Bobby. Here's what I wrote. I wrote, in the book, just like real life, more is constantly being revealed to us. So I had this idea for the opening of the film. Visually, I imagine it can open with extreme close-ups on random objects, a letter, a stack of papers, details of the room, family heirlooms, a photograph. They're so close up that they're sort of obscure, maybe out of focus. Then little by little, more is revealed. The mood in the room is slow, thoughtful, quiet, like you are anticipating something. The camera eventually shows Bobby. He puts on his glasses, starts to read an excerpt from his book's introduction. It feels like you're sitting in the room with someone you know well, who is about to tell you something meaningful. And he begins to say,
This book is a product of my own struggle to understand how the idealistic institutions our country built to safeguard both public health.
What I did was I selected a few passages from the beginning that I thought really encapsulated what you're about to see and experience.
I am a lifelong Democrat whose family has had 80 years of deep engagement with America's public health bureaucracy and long friendships with key federal regulators, including Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, and Robert Käla. Members of my family wrote many of the statutes under which these men govern. They nurtured the growth of equitable and effective public health policies and defended that regulatory bulwark against ferocious attacks funded by industry. I built my own alliances with these individuals and their agencies during my years of environmental and public health advocacy, but I also watched how the industry, supposedly being regulated, used its indentured servants on Capitol Hill and its financial clout to systematically hollow out those agencies beginning in the 1980s, disabling their regulatory function and transforming them into sock puppets for the very industry Congress charged them with regulating. I explore the carefully planned militarization and monetization of medicine that has left American health ailing and our democracy shattered. I chronicle the troubling role of the dangerously concentrated mainstream media.
You're really attacking not only Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're attacking science.
big tech robber barons, the military and intelligence communities, and their deep historical alliance with Big Pharma and the public health agencies. The disturbing story that unfolds here has never been told, and many in power have worked hard to prevent the public from learning it. The principal character is Anthony Fauci.
So it starts off with this sort of awakening, and then at the end, the memorable end that I wanted to build is that solution-based hope, inspiration, motivation, what we can do with this information in a positive way, to take the darkness and turn it into something light, something powerful. You can hear these stories and it could just make you fearful. It can just be sort of paralyzing. But that would never be the message that I would want anyone to walk away with, because it's also not the message of the book. And the book ends like I was almost, wanting to cry, because it was Bobby Kennedy's last paragraph, bringing in Martin Luther King and a powerful message of hope and change, and that if we stand together, we can accomplish anything. His last sentence was, "I'll see you on the barricades," which he has also said to crowds in rallies at different times and different places. But also just reading it in the book, it was very impactful, and I felt like that's the message that we've got to also leave with the movie.
Telling them today, you are not going to take away our freedom. You are not going to poison our children. We are going to demand our democracy back. Thank you all very much for fighting.
It's a privilege to be shoulder to shoulder with so many different kinds of people in the trenches, and my message to all of them is, I'll see you on the barricades.
I broke down the chronology into 4 parts just to sort of keep everything organized, and so the first one, of course, starts in the 80s. So that first part would span 20 years. When Anthony Fauci became director of the NIAID, that was 1984, and I loved that it was 1984 for Orwellian reasons, of course. So it had to start 1984. It was just perfect.
Fauci's reign begins in 1984. Everything changes in 1984. Fauci becomes the director of the NIAID.
This saw the rise of Dr. Fauci to his current stardom.
I would like to introduce Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1984.
Dr. Fauci understood that he could basically save his government agency by defining AIDS as an infectious disease.
And then once Fauci partnered with Bill Gates in 2000, profiteering and dangerous gain-of-function experimentation really accelerated dramatically.
He had a bunch of international global health leaders that he invited to his home that was showing everyone in the tour of the house. And he said, "Can I have some time with you in my library, in this amazingly beautiful library?" And it was there that he said, "Tony, you run the biggest infectious disease institute in the world, and I want to make sure the money I spend is well spent. Why don't we really get to know each other? Why don't we be partners?" Our interactions and our collaborations became closer and closer with tuberculosis, with HIV, with the vaccine.
Starting in 2001, there was a new epidemic scare almost every other year. Whether it was a bioterrorism threat or of zoonotic origin, there always seemed to be something that was brewing, and Fauci was right there at the center of it all. Part 3 was the year 2020.
A SARS-like virus, which has infected hundreds in China, has now reached the United States.
We have already started at the NIH and with many of our collaborators on the developing of a vaccine.
The side effects for the Moderna vaccine sound concerning. We looked. After the second dose, at least 80% of participants experienced a systemic side effect. So, are these vaccines safe?
Well, the FDA, not being pressured, will look hard at that. The FDA is the gold standard of regulators, and their current guidance on this, if they stick with that, is very, very appropriate.
They have been working on this technology for a long time, but they've had a lot of problems with it. They haven't been able to get it to where it can work. It's too toxic, and they see this as a tremendous opportunity. And Fauci sees it, Bill Gates sees it. They've been heavily vested in this mRNA technology as a new revolutionary concept in biology, in medicine.
And part 4 was the year 2030 plus, or 2030 and beyond.
There will be other pandemics and other major health emergencies. No single government or multilateral agency can address this threat alone. Together, we must be better prepared to predict, prevent, detect, assess, and effectively respond to pandemics in a highly coordinated fashion. The 194 member states of the World Health Organization resolved to work together towards a new international instrument for pandemic preparedness and response.
This treaty involves some rather concerning propositions, and this includes that the WHO would have the authority, in the event of another pandemic, who would decide what the disease is called, how you would measure the disease, how you would test for the disease, the safety standards of the vaccines or whatever treatments they decide. It could be that these vaccines get developed in 100 days, which is totally ludicrous. Also, they could decide on who has to have them, whether they get mandated and so on, which is totally unacceptable and not to be tolerated.
Another one of my initial thoughts was that for Bobby's interviews, I chose only when he writes from his own perspective, his personal experiences, or that of his family's.
Operation Northwood was a proposal that was put in front of my uncle by his Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was a false flag event. He's the people like General Lemonster and Curtis LeMay who had won World War II. And there was no more respected military leaders in our country. And they said to him, we should plant bombs and kill American citizens in order to justify an unprovoked attack on Cuba. My uncle heard their proposal, said nothing to them, walked out of the meeting in the middle of the proposal, and said to one of his aides, and we call ourselves the human race. He was disgusted. These were the most respected military and intelligence officers alive at that time.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
And when the book has Bobby explaining neutral information such as facts and statistics, I assigned that information to one of the experts that we're interviewing, a physician, a scientist, a historian. So I would choose people who I found to be well-versed on whatever that subject was, and then put the questions to them, because initially I wanted to just keep Bobby Kennedy's parts as his own personal sort of awakening, his journey.
In 2016, when I met with Tony Fauci, we had a very, very heated meeting. I was with Aaron Seary, who's another attorney, and Del Bigtree and Lynn Redwood. Sat across from the table from him and Francis Collins and the other public health leadership. And I said to him during that meeting, you've been publicly saying that there are safety studies done on these vaccines prior to getting a license. They say that there are none. There was an observer from the White House at that meeting, so he was under some pressure to defend his record, and he said, well, there are studies. And I said, can you show us any? And they made a show of looking through a series of briefcases and files to try to find what they were looking for, and they said, we'll send them to you. And of course, they never sent them. And at the end of that meeting, I was in the hallway, and Tony Fauci came up to me and took me aside and had a quiet conversation with me out of earshot of everybody else. And he said, I want to commend you for what you're doing. It's important work, and you keep us all on our toes. So thank you. And that was his message to me. You can be the judge of how earnest he was.
In the end, we did start using narration from the book. Bobby did a whole second interview with me to fill in some of the blanks. Because of the vast amount of information in the book, I needed to cover about 4 decades from investigative journalists, doctors, scientists, etc., to tell the story starting in the 80s, because that was what I decided would be the starting point. And a lot of the people that contributed to the Real Anthony Fauci book had been around from those days in the HIV/AIDS time period until today, the COVID period, and so much in between. It was just absolutely mind-blowing where it has Anthony Fauci's imprint along the way. So it was going to be a lot of interview questions for these individuals. Almost every single one of the 18 people interviewed for this movie had about 3 pages of questions that I deeply researched and wrote up. Selecting which people to go into the movie was also an interesting process, because just like in a narrative, I thought about the personalities in the movie as I was selecting them. Not only was the content important to tell the story from start to finish, but if there was a personal account or an emotional or historic component to the story, if that person had a dramatic story to tell, that was going to be really valuable. In other words, I had to think about how certain things that I read in the book would actually look visually. So I had to sort of select people that were going to tell a story that I can create little kind of like mini movies within the movie.
I went to Hawthorne, New York, and I located this grave site. And what it looks like if you're standing before it, it was a semicircle of large tombstones with names engraved on the tombstones. I remember there were stuffed animals and flowers and hearts and things adorning those tombstones. And I also remember there were flies buzzing around. There was a mound, a gigantic hole in the ground covered by astroturf, and it wasn't nailed down, it was just covered. And I went over and I took a corner of the astroturf, and I remember, my heart was pounding. I lifted it up, and inside was just a lot of coffins. They were in there haphazardly. And apparently there was more than one child in each coffin.
The drug companies which have supported trials at Incarnation include some of the world's largest. They also refuse to be interviewed for this program. Officials at the National Institutes for Health insist that any participation of children in drug trials should be voluntary in every sense.
These little children are regarded as throwaway children. Nothing really was done to punish those who broke the law.
In the book, there were many voices, many experts, and riveting personal accounts from individuals that had spanned the decades. Some had close encounters with Fauci, such as Celia Farber, who had just incredible stories to tell.
HIV was never present by any means in all cases of AIDS, but Anthony Fauci made sure that there was a perfect correlation by eliminating about 5,000 HIV negative AIDS cases. There was a conference in Amsterdam in the early 1990s, an AIDS conference. Doctors started to go to the podium in a session where they were talking about HIV negative AIDS, and they began to say, yeah, I have some too. I have a clinical AIDS patient, has every symptom but tests negative on every test no matter how many times they test. And so there was a clamor, there was a sense of anxiety. Wait a minute, what is this? Could it be? Could it be that Peter Duesberg is right? And Anthony Fauci flew in on Air Force Two to that conference, and he did his thing, and he quashed it. He just quashed it. He gave a statement through Newsweek that this just wasn't an issue. It was a misunderstanding. And what they did at that moment was they took all of the HIV-negative AIDS cases and they renamed them and threw them out of the official definition.
One thing that was interesting and very sad was that there were individuals that I really wanted in the movie, and they had passed away. Carrie Mullis unexpectedly died of pneumonia in August of 2019, just about a month before the COVID virus started circulating in Wuhan. He was the inventor of the PCR test that is used today to detect COVID and was also used in the 80s to detect HIV. And he had been very outspoken starting in the 80s.
Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking, he doesn't know anything really about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and should not be in a position like he's in.
He repeatedly said, including on tape, you should not use the PCR test to diagnose clinical infection with viruses. He repeatedly said that. What are we doing? Using the PCR test to distinguish clinical diagnostic tests with viruses.
They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. They change them when they want to. And they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people that pay his salary and lie directly into the camera.
When Bob Käla proved that it was the etiologic agent in 1984, we had a diagnostic test approved by the FDA in 1985. That was really quick, from literally less than a year from the time that it was shown to be the virus that causes this disease.
And he continued to be outspoken in many interviews. Carrie Mullis is a kind of superstar, and Luc Montagnier was another one. Luc Montagnier actually passed away, I believe it was right before I started writing this script. That was pretty devastating. He had been outspoken about COVID. All the way up until his death, he was studying the virus and came up with some shocking information. And he was around in the 80s with the AIDS and HIV because he is the one that found and isolated the HIV virus.
Luc Montagnier was always an interesting figure and always a thorn in the side of the orthodoxy.
HIV by itself, or some strains of HIV, are not sufficient to induce AIDS. Even from the beginning, actually, we thought maybe for the activation of that virus in cells, we need some cofactors.
Cofactors are not necessary.
So, approaching this adaptation, not only did I feel an intense responsibility to do right by it, but, I didn't want to make it my own. I wanted to really make it the book. I wanted to make it loyal and faithful to all of the tremendous work and even personality that went into it. It felt like a very personal book, and it was in many ways because of his family and his own advocacy work. So I really wanted to honor that. And so I thought one way to do that would be to bring in the book as a sort of character itself. So we've got Bobby, we've got these co-stars, which are the other interviewees, and we also have the book itself. So the way I envisioned it, like this animation that came to life and the pages flipping and like diving into like an old treasure map or an old encyclopedia, getting to the page and then the camera moving into the words. And so That's another character in this movie. There are these really great subchapter titles in the Real Anthony Fauci book, and I had used them in the first draft of the script, but ended up not using them in the final, only because as we were going along and interviews are being added and certain things have to sort of move around to accommodate some unexpected, maybe new stories or some things that maybe had to be taken out. The script, of course, is like kind of in constant flux. And somewhere along the way, those little subchapter titles, which were really cool, I really wanted them on screen, but slowly disappeared from my script. But so that's one thing that I wish that I had time to put back in and find like a home for them, because they were really neat. As I was writing the script, as I was putting it together, I was also pulling stuff, pulling images, writing, trying to visualize, and then try to grab things. I had already been doing so much of my own personal research starting mid-2020, so I was about, it's almost like without knowing it, I was sort of preparing to make this movie, because I was collecting and downloading documents and videos and old documentaries and things that I thought could be scrubbed from the internet and things that were actually scrubbed from certain websites that I would then later find in, you know, the archives online or somewhere. And those, I wanted to save them, and I thought there'll be something I'll do with it. I'm sure I'll either write or make a movie or both or something. But I felt just intuitively that this was important to collect this stuff. So as a result, it was very cool that I had folders and folders of stuff that I had been collecting. But of course, there was so much more to do, because like I said, this book went even, you know, just so much deeper than my own research, just so much farther. My research for this film included locating archival footage, images, using old documentary films, government documents, whistleblower accounts. But the extensive endnotes of each chapter in Bobby's book was the most important to this task. Links to, it could be a documentary, it could be a government document, it could be, you know, one of many things. So that was extraordinarily helpful. Because Bobby had done all of the research in this book, it ended up being much faster than had I had to do everything from scratch. However, I soon found that the censorship of this book was so pervasive, so insidious. For example, I would click on something that's supposed to bring me to, let's say, Anthony Fauci's leaked emails. The link reroutes to some other website, let's say PBS interview with Toni Morrison and Charlie Rose. This one actually happened to me. It was actually a really interesting interview, so I got totally distracted for a few minutes while I was like in the middle of trying to get this one thing. But you know, it's just another way of trying to invalidate all of this information, all of these facts. I thought that was really telling, really important. You know, I really want people to know about that as well.